Alright, so in the last set of notes for Unit 7, we're going to be looking mostly at World War I. So let's start with our introduction. So just after the November 1912 election, President-elect Woodrow Wilson was still living in Princeton and told one of his former faculty colleagues how ironic it would be if his administration had to deal chiefly with foreign affairs because he had run and all of the things he had kind of proposed were more domestic. And so it is quite ironic that he is going to be president while the United States finds itself in World War I. So let's start with the war and what began it. So the war, of course, starts in Europe. So on June 28, 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand who is the heir to the Austrian-Hungary Empire, and his wife are assassinated by a Serbian nationalist who wanted independence for Serbia. Now, how some of the stories go is that the assassin had planned this, and he knew where Archduke Franz Ferdinand parade route was going to be, and then last minute they had to change the Archduke's route in that parade because of a traffic jam, and so the assassin missed his shot and his opportunity, and so as he's kind of sulking in a bar, he sees the Archduke, and that is when he takes his shot and kills both the Archduke and his wife. Now, when this happened, nothing could have seemed more far removed from the United States than these murders happening to Central European families, to American citizens. However, within a very short amount of time, the impacts of the assassination are going to be felt worldwide. So, and this is a picture of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife. So, what are things like before the World War? Well, actually, in the summer of 1914, Europe was actually at peace. Now, they were at peace, but there were many movements and challenges against several empire central governments, and not everybody's happy, such as the newly united Germany was angry at being shut out of the colonies in Africa and Asia by the speed in which the British and the French had moved. So you see this armed race that had developed among the continent's greatest powers and in their quest for security. So the European nations had developed a complex series of defense alliances, and the two major alliances were the Central Powers, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire, and then the Allies, Russia, France, and Great Britain. All of these factors quickly led Europe to stumble into an all-out war when Austria set out to punish Serbia for killing their Archduke, and then Russia came to the Serbians' aid in an alliance agreement. So by August, all of Europe was engulfed in what was called the Great War. We do not call it World War I, or that term is not coined until after the outbreak of World War II. And so at first, at the beginning of the war, many Europeans were caught up in this patriotic fever, and young men signed up promptly and marched off proudly to fight in the war, and both sides expected that it was going to be an easy victory, a quick victory, but the result was a long and costly war with new forms of tactics and weapons. And so the main reasons and the main factors of the Great War are militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism, the main causes of World War I. Now, let's look at the beginning of the Great War. So Germany attacked France by moving through neutral Belgium and was quickly 30 miles outside of Paris very early in the war. So the Allied counteroffensive drove the Germans back, and by November of 1914, both sides were dug in for a long trench warfare that would not move very much or very quickly. And though every small move in this fighting ended up costing thousands of soldiers their lives, and this would go on until March of 1918. So there was very many long years of trench warfare that were very, very ghastly. And in 1916, at one of the battles, the Battle of the Somme, 60,000 British soldiers were killed in one single day. In a year-long battle for a town, 1 million soldiers ended up being killed. But these new forms of artillery, tanks, flamethrowers, along with the introduction of poisonous mustard gas, caused what seemed like the never-ending waves of death. While life in the trenches involved living for months with mud, rats, and rotten feet. But despite these costs, the battle line really didn't change significantly throughout all the years of fighting. So as this is happening, what does the United States think? Well, Wilson called it this vast, gruesome contest of destruction. And so many saw the developments as really a distant tragedy that's really awful that it's happening over there, but we're not involved in it. Herbert Hoover, who's going to become an American president, he organized the Commission for Belgian Relief, which along with the American Red Cross sent aid to people caught up in the warpath. Hoover gained international fame as the Napoleon of Mercy for his efforts. But, however, most Americans still preferred not to get involved and agreed with the U.S. ambassador on, thank goodness for the Atlantic Ocean between us. President Wilson declared neutrality with World War I and the Great War. Now, he wanted to stay out of the war, and he understood that a European war would stir up deep tensions in his own nation, the United States, which was made up of immigrants from every single one of the nations that was involved in the Great War in Europe at the time. But neutrality, however, would not be easy to maintain. So that brings us to the Great War and the United States. So there are a few impacts initially that we see. The warfare on land and on the oceans around Europe cut into U.S. trade, hurting wheat farmers and cotton growers who could not get their goods to the European markets. The Wilson administration had to steer a pretty difficult course while facing considerable international pressures. So former President Teddy Roosevelt urged massive buildup of the Army and the Navy as well as a military draft, all in the name of just being prepared for an eventual war on the side of the British and the French. That way we're ready when we need to fight. And so from Teddy Roosevelt's perspective, Wilson was being dangerously passive. Now, in the contrast to that, a lot of our progressive movements, like Senator from Wisconsin and other politicians, especially those from the states with large German populations, since Germany is in this war, led a peace movement, fearing that Wilson was, edging towards war, trying to convince Wilson not to go to war. Jane Addams even led a large women's movement for peace. But between 1914 and 1916, in spite of Roosevelt's best efforts to build support for being prepared and ready for war, most Americans in and out of office favored keeping as far away as they could from Europe and its possible problems. We did not want to get entangled in them. So, one of the many diplomatic tensions that the war in Europe created, which is by far the greatest, had to do with the Germans' use of a new kind of sea power, or the German U-boat, which is very similar to a submarine. Now, Britain's navy ruled the waves of the ocean, but Germany's U-boats could glide under the waves and strike a ship bringing supplies to Britain or France, with pretty much without even being detected. So on February 6, 1915, the German admiral announced that the waters around Great Britain were a war zone, and its submarines would freely attack any ship that was bringing supplies to Great Britain. Now, Wilson and Bryan sent a formal diplomatic note that sinking ships without warning was an act so unprecedented in naval warfare that the U.S. would hold them to a strict accountability. Now, somehow submarine warfare and having ships struck by a torpedo seemingly out of nowhere terrified people in a way that direct ship-to-ship combat did not. It's just this new technology. And submarine warfare also threatened the profitable U.S. trade with Great Britain. So in March of 1915, when a submarine sank a small British passenger ship and one American citizen was killed, Americans are kind of starting to think differently, and so is the United States government. But then, on May 7, 1915, a submarine sank the British passenger liner, the Lusitania, which is the greatest and fastest ocean liner in service at the time. The Lusitania sank in 18 minutes, and 1,198 people were killed, including 127 American citizens. The U.S. demanded an immediate apology from Germany. And so Secretary of State Bryan suggested that the United States should issue a formal warning to American citizens not to travel on ships belonging to countries that were at war, but Woodrow Wilson refused to publish that and put it out to the American citizens. Germany did send secret orders to its submarine captains to avoid large passenger liners, but the damage really had already been done. So, to kind of wrap everything up, several years passed after the sinking of the Lusitania, and many political, foreign, and diplomatic actions occurred. But it was not enough to stop the United States from getting involved in what is going to be known as the First World War.